We're back again. We're going to talk about legal reforms this time, economics this time period, foreign policy. The Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson, women's suffrage, the Grange movement, Farmers Alliance, the Populist Party, also called the People's Party, Sherman Antitrust Act, William Jennings Bryan, William McKinley, Spanish-American War, and the Philippine War. Any questions on this? Justice does not come in on wheels of inevitability. Martin Luther King used to write extensively about the idea that, except it's a mistaken idea that time will inevitably cure all ills. Time can be used either constructively or destructively. What had been progress during Reconstruction for civil rights were quickly struck down once the planter class returned to power in the South. Okay, we're chapter 21 here. But the several laws were passed in the 1880s, 1890s, the Jim Crow laws. And the courts were used as a possible remedy to try to cure these ills. But civil rights activists found increasingly that the courts were not only indifferent, but in many cases hostile to the causes of civil liberties. We'll get to the case Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, previously, the Supreme Court had ruled a number of cases that the government could prohibit discrimination by the government, but could not prevent discrimination on the basis of individuals and private corporations. Of course, the 14th Amendment guaranteed full equality and full civil rights of all citizens before the law. It said no matter the race. Of course, go all the way back to the Declaration of Independence. Basic Constitution is the government is supposed to protect the rights of the people. Except other governments in the past had been threats to the rights of the people, but individuals can also be threats to the rights of other individuals. It's the question, what is the slogan at the Supreme Court building, which was played in the 1930s, equal justice under law. Well, a lot of Southern governments started passing laws mandating that private businesses, private individuals, and private corporations discriminate against other races. Passing laws mandating segregated hotel rooms, restaurants, and other places. And so, you come to New Orleans, Louisiana. New Orleans had long been a very cosmopolitan community. Had that mixture of French culture, American culture, had that mix of black and white, Native American, and so many others. It's often said that in southern Louisiana, everybody's a mix of something. But nevertheless, though, there was still this steady division. The African-American community in New Orleans, you had a contingent that was very poor, but you also had a very prosperous business community in New Orleans, made up of African-American business community. And what ends up happening, though, is in spite of the influence that New Orleans had, the state ends up passing a law mandating a segregated railroad system. passing Louisiana. Now, initially, the law said all trains were to be segregated on the basis of race, or to have a whites-only car and a car for non-whites only. And there were signs to be posted in each car saying whites only, and the term they used at the time was colored only. Now, there's an organization in New Orleans, primarily the African American business community, called the Equal Rights Association. And they took this to court. And the courts initially struck down the law on the basis that the state cannot prohibit or regulate rail traffic coming across state lines. That's a federal matter. The Constitution says only the federal government can regulate commerce across state lines. So the state legislature went back and passed one for only within the state of Louisiana. That all rail traffic within Louisiana had to be segregated. So they try again. In this case, they get a man named Homer Plessy. Plessy is a carpenter. He's 1/8 African American. He's 7/8 white. It is, he had one great-grandparent who was African American. But, I don't know what they had at the time, they were notoriously called the one-drop rule, because he had any African American ancestry at all, even though it was not really noticeable. He was considered to be black under law. He had one great-grandparent who was African American. But under law, he would have to sit in the colored-only section. Interesting thing about Louisiana is you have the Cajun population there. Like I said, usually very dark-skinned, curly hair, and there were a lot of Cajuns for many years listed as colored or black. So their French had no African ancestry, but census takers have listed them as black, just because of the stereotypical appearance. But in this case of Plessy, like I said, no Cajun ancestry, but tiny little bit of African American ancestry. This kind of shows us kind of the ridiculous lengths that some of these laws would go to. It is this bizarre, almost paranoid classification of people based on race, ancestry, appearance. Plessy was chosen as the test case. Basically, they had to get somebody to basically file the law to start the lawsuit. They could just arbitrarily file a lawsuit saying, no, we're not going to do this. Well, the Equal Rights Association informed the railroad company about this, and the railroad company is supportive of it. You see, the railroads didn't want this law either, because it meant for them they'd have to carry extra cars, mandate with segregated rail cars. They'd have the same number of passengers, but have to carry extra cars because they're split on the basis of race. More money for them, they didn't want to have to deal with it. So they say, okay. The Plessy boards and sits in the white-only car. And they have somebody come up and tell the conductor and said, this man is not white. There's one drop rule. And they end up having him arrested. So they take him through the New Orleans District Courts, on up to the state courts, to the federal court. the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy, the original complainant, Ferguson was a New Orleans district judge who heard the case at the lower levels. And it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The Florida Equal Rights Association hires tries to make an issue out of this delicate racial balance and these bizarre racial concepts that the segregated rail car law is trying to produce. Noting, among other things, that Plessy, to all appearances, was white, and to be, that time period, the reputation of being white basically opened a lot of doors for him. Doors that would not have been open to him if he were African American or any other race. The statement basically was that being labeled as non-white robbed him of a lot of economic opportunities, robbed him of his reputation, robbed him of property. Therefore, it's not a protection of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Additionally, there were exceptions to the segregated rail car law. Non-whites could sit in the whites-only car if they were sitting with a white employer. That if they're just sitting there on their own as private citizens, they could not be there. They could not sit with a white man or white woman as an equal. But as a subordinate, they could. And therein showed the very purpose of this law. It was not to create equal facilities or separate the races. It was to subordinate, subjugate non-white races. But in spite of these arguments, the Supreme Court ended up ruling 7-1 against Plessy. And instituted something called the separate but equal doctrine. This would dominate civil rights law for the next 60 years. That is, separate but equal. There's the idea that segregation was legal so long as you provided equal facilities for other races. The long center in this case was that Justice John Harlan said the law is clearly prejudicial, but this set the precedent for the next 60 years. And after Plessy, a wave of new segregation laws were passed across the South. Statewide level, county, local level in the South, but even in some municipalities, some cities in the North too. So segregation was mostly Southern, but you did find instances in the North as well. You find such things as a 1915 South Carolina law which forbade black and white employees to work in the same room in textile factories. Employees could not be working together. Atlanta, Georgia, there was a law that black and white witnesses had to have separate Bibles to swear in on. That is, they could not touch the same Bible. 1909, Mobile, Alabama. Law set a 10 p.m. curfew, but for blacks only. And so on and so on. Humiliation after humiliation, law after law. Civil rights, the African American community was set back on itself, stunned by the ruling, deeply divided over what course of action to take next. And there's an intense debate among African American leaders about just what kind of action to take. Some, such as Booker T. Washington, Washington in 1895 a speech called the Atlanta Compromise. Basically saying that African Americans have to accept they're not going to be treated equally under the law. The African American community has to work to build up itself in every way. Its own educational institutions, its own business institutions, its own communities. Basically, maybe one day buy its way into the white community, its economic strength. And part of that was Washington said that African Americans are probably going to have to accept that they aren't going to be able to go to their own go to universities, or just have to accept trade school educations. That deeply upset a lot of people, basically saying, settle. So this man, W.E.B. Du Bois, in 1906 established something called the Niagara Movement. After Niagara Falls, New York, he and a group of followers met at a convention in 1906. But they had to meet on the Canadian side of Niagara Falls because the hotel rooms on the New York side would not rent rooms to African Americans. Du Bois was the first, French pronunciation is Du Bois, but he pronounced it Du Bois. He is the first African American to receive a doctorate from Harvard University. First one ever. And his movement ended up leading to the creation of the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, in 1909. It's the oldest civil rights organization in the country. Basically, the NAACP said was full equality, full civil rights, no exceptions, no compromise. Nothing less than the rights that are guaranteed under the Constitution. It's a full university educations, everything. It ended up being the NAACP. It ended up leading most of the challenges to these early challenges to segregation laws. In the 1920s, you have the legal branch of the NAACP, led by a man named Charles Houston, and Thurgood Marshall. Marshall ended up being on the Supreme Court in the 1960s. Thurgood. Yeah. Thurgood came on about the 1930s, but Charles Houston really kind of started, going. But the legal branch, the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, they went across the country challenging segregation laws wherever they could. Because one thing you always could tell about segregation was it's separate but equal, but it's never equal. Like I said, the segregated water fountains. The white one would be nice, neat, clean. The color-only fountain was old, dirty, broken down. Segregated bathrooms. White bathrooms, nice, clean. African-American bathrooms. Probably an outhouse out back. Segregated schools. White schools always had the best of everything. These beautiful new brick buildings, new school books. African-American schools, they get these worn-out used textbooks the white school have been using after about 10 years that are falling apart and drawn all over. African-American teachers paid a lot less. There are several instances which school boards would shut down the African-American high schools just because they wanted to. So African Americans have their education cut off basically at the 8th grade. And is the NAACP trying to fight this? So a lot of the early cases That's a complete failure. But slowly, steadily, they met with a little bit of progress here and there. What they will do with these little victories is not just victories for these individual communities, but also set legal precedents. This court works on precedent. What's been ruled on before? What is the most previous law? And so if those little precedents building up, they'll build a body of law which is eventually able to challenge Plessy directly. To show that this idea of separate but equal was anything but equal. Not only was the reality not equal, but there's no way you could separate people and make it equal. Simply just was not possible. And that's what's ended up starting over the next 60 years after Plessy. Now you get into the politics of the 1880s, a little bit. You have one of relative stability, at least at the national level. Party loyalties often remain very strong, often tied to ethnicity and religion. And so the Democratic side, the 1880s and the 1890s, if you're a Democrat at this time, you tend to be immigrants. Like I said, the Democratic Party has always been the party of immigrants, ever since Thomas Jefferson. But also Roman Catholics, the Irish. The Irish, of course, are almost always Roman Catholic and almost always immigrants. There have been a couple of generations of it. And Confederate veterans, which have a good portion of the South. And usually just the lower classes, essentially Democrats attracting the outcasts of society. Republicans tended to attract the upper classes. We call today evangelical Protestants, or Christian conservatives. Germans, African Americans, there's a large contingent of ethnic Germans in the Midwest at this point. Actually, after the English, Scottish, and Irish, Germans were one of the largest ethnic groups of the United States. But African Americans are still tending to vote overwhelmingly Republican because they're still seeing that connection to Lincoln and the Civil War. But it's at this point, by the 1890s forward, the Republican Party is going to steadily drop its support for civil rights. And it's because of the very bizarre configuration of politics in the South. Like I say, the Republican Party exists only in the South because of federal patronage. Like I say, a chance to become a federal judge or a U.S. postmaster because you're a Republican and there is a Republican president. But otherwise, you have a lot of the white population in the South. If they lived in any other part of the country, they'd be Republicans. And that always confounded Republicans. That's going to cause a lot of problems and a lot of division for the Republican Party over how to capture that conservative white vote in the South, especially when we start getting to the 1920s. But generally, this is the makeup of the political parties in the 1880s and 1890s. If you're one of these, you're going to be either this or this. Like I said, people very rarely change political affiliation. You almost never see a party switching. You'd almost never see people crossing ballot lines. Vote for one member of one party, then vote for one race, and then the next race vote for somebody of another party. You almost never saw that. Party loyalty was very thick. Presidential elections tend to remain extremely close in the popular cause between 1876 and 1896. Republicans tended to dominate the Senate while the Democrats controlled the House, regaining it in 1874 and holding it for 16 out of the next 20 years. Now, talk about the 1880 election, the James Garfield election last time. But now we get to the election of 1884. The Democrats nominate New York Governor Grover Cleveland. Cleveland had built a reputation of fighting corruption, fighting Tammany Hall, that is the corrupt Democratic machine in New York City. It's one thing to attack corruption in the other guy's party. It's another thing to attack it in your own. Pick out people's attention. Interesting thing about Cleveland was he had been sheriff of Erie County, that is Buffalo, New York. And in those days, as sheriff, one of his responsibilities was he had to carry out executions. Cleveland was actually the only president to actually ever hang someone as part of the legal process. Well, the Republican Senate veteran Senator James G. Blaine of Maine. Okay, your books here, page 658, see a picture of Senator Blaine. 660, see a picture of Governor Cleveland. Now, Blaine had been a champion of reform. But there's kind of a scurrilous campaign because of some of the things being thrown out. Because turns out there's something with a skeleton in Cleveland's closet. At least the story was. Well, just after Cleveland gets the nomination, this widow from Buffalo steps forward and claims that Cleveland had fathered her child out of wedlock. Well, here's the thing, though. This child had been born in 1874. She was a widow, long been widowed, never got remarried. And says Cleveland was the baby daddy. But here's the thing. Turns out there were several possible fathers. Several of them were prominent married men in Buffalo. So she got around a little bit. Right, no DNA test, no blood testing time at this time period. The name of this child was Oscar Folsom Cleveland. Had the last name Cleveland, but the first and middle name, Oscar Folsom, that was the name of Cleveland's best friend and one of the possible fathers. I kid you not.
Who got sloppy seconds?
We ain't going there. Basically, because Cleveland's the only guy who is single, these other guys who were married and wanted to stay married, Cleveland took the fall for me, accepted responsibility. He sent child support. Well, they didn't have child support laws back then, but he was helped raise the child. But he never married her because he said basically the woman's just too crazy. It was a huge scandal in 1884. It's unheard of. It's still something that might ruin somebody's political career today, but 1884, this is so destroy most people.
She did want some money to
Well, supporters asked him what to say. They're in a panic once they hear about this. Cleveland's simple reply was, tell the truth. No matter what, just tell the truth. Said there are several possible fathers. I had a relationship. I accept responsibility. But I'm not going to marry this crazy woman. Republican seized on this, portraying this image of this poor widowed woman in tears and this infant crying, "Where's my paw?" But Democrats had plenty of their own ammunition against Blaine. One thing about this level of politics is you got to learn to fight from the gutter. Like I say, you're not going to have these nice, polite campaigns of ideas. It's who's the loudest, who gets the most attention. Like I say, if you think campaigns today are dirty, you didn't see politics in the 1880s. Like I say, look at these guys, they say amateurs. So the Democratic slogan was Blaine, Blaine, James G. Blaine, the Continental Liar from the state of Maine. Oh, they're making fun of him. They're just getting warmed up. And part of Blaine's problem was his own supporters. Group of Protestant ministers went to Republican headquarters in New York and referred to the Democrats as the party of, quote, rum, Romanism, and rebellion. The Democratic newspapers picked this up and distributed it all over the country. You didn't have a professional press back then. Basically, you had an openly partisan press. Large cities had a Republican newspaper and they had a Democratic newspaper. And of course, the Democrats played this to where they could. The idea of rum, Romanism, rebellion. It's a huge slur. Basically, talking about who's voting for the Democrats. Rum is a slur on the Irish. They're saying they're just a bunch of drunks. Next, I have plenty of Irish in my family, and all the alcoholics are on the German side. Did I say that? Yes, I said that. That's just my family. Romanism, that's a slur against Roman Catholics. It is the Roman Catholic Church. It's the Holy Universal Apostolic Church. Rebellion, waving the bloody shirt. Upsetting all those Union veterans, and you still have quite a few alive in 1884. So they did not go to war to support the Republican Party. They went to war to support their country. So basically, they stepped in pretty deep. Blaine did nothing to disavow these comments. In fact, some Democratic papers suggested that Blaine even said it. But of course, there are no videotape back then. Recorded sound is only in its infancy, so you have no idea who really said what. So this ends up becoming the issue of the campaign. Not the baby daddy. The thing is, Blaine had always prided himself on cultivating a following among the Irish in the United States. He delivered a series of strong anti-British speeches in the Senate condemning Britain's occupation of Ireland, which was very violent, sparking a lot of rebellions, which ordinarily had attracted a lot of sympathy and support from the Irish. But now this comment starts being thrown out. It ends up alienating those supporters he had. So as a result, Cleveland ends up winning the election by less than 30,000 votes. It's 48.5% of the vote, 219 electoral votes. The 48.2% for Blaine gets 182 electoral votes. And they have a couple third-party candidates in there. Benjamin Butler, the Greenback Labor Party. And the Prohibition Party, it's a single-issue party dedicated to the idea of making alcohol legal in the United States. A man named John P. St. John, actual name. Gets 1.5% of the vote. They have a steady following among the prohibitionists at the time, but eventually they have two parties trying to co-opt that one degree or another. In this case, the election goes to Cleveland. Like I said, Democrats are jubilant. This is the first national election they had won since 1856. Actually, the 1876 election, they'd won the popular vote, but all sorts of chicanery in the Electoral College of going to Republicans. That's the first one that won clear and outright. South, huge celebrations. It's gone so heavily for Cleveland. That's why you have here in downtown Cleveland Street, after Cleveland. And so Democrats responded to the GOP mantra of, "Where's my pa?" by adding, "Gone to the White House." Ha ha ha. Like I said, Cleveland had a moderately successful presidency. In 1887, he devoted a State of the Union address to the issue of the tariff, a protective tariff that had been in place for several decades, basically raising prices on foreign goods coming into the United States. That it was designed basically to raise prices on foreign products so high that basically had no economic choice but to buy the American-made product, simply shielding American industry from foreign competition. That's been in place for decades. But there has been a lot of criticism of protective tariffs in the 1800s because it often meant that tariffs are being raised on American products abroad. So we're raising products on their tariffs, but they're in turn raising products on our tariffs. You got to remember, America's a rising industrial power. By 1890, there is nobody in the world who can outproduce or outmanufacture the United States. And the U.S. is looking to the global marketplace. Cleveland is saying that protective tariff is damaging American business abroad. Next thing, and a lot of these products having tariffs raised on them included American agricultural products. Products raised in the South, the Midwest, the Plains. So a lot of those aren't being sold abroad or sold as hot as well because of the protective tariff. So Cleveland denounced the protective tariff as what he called vicious, inequitable, and illogical, and committed the Democratic Party to lowering the tariff. The Republicans, in turn, turned around and accused Cleveland of trying to undermine American industry. So, the election of 1888 comes along. And essentially, the tariff becomes the issue. Democrats wrote Cleveland again. And Republicans nominate Indiana Congressman Benjamin Harrison. Harrison is a devout defender of the tariff. He's also the grandson of the 9th president, William Henry Harrison. Interestingly enough, 48 years after his grandfather was elected president, he's actually able to appeal to some people who actually voted for him. Well, here's the thing. Another very close election. Remember, the president, though, is elected in the Electoral College. So Cleveland actually ends up winning 90,000 more popular votes than Harrison does. He's the choice of most people in the country, but because so many states are decided so narrowly on the popular column, he ended up winning some by wider margins in 1888 and 1884, but a couple of key states he had won in 1884 ends up losing very narrowly. Cleveland is the choice of the people, but only gets 168 electoral votes. whereas Harrison gets only 47.9% of the vote and 233 electoral votes. Yeah, so he ends up winning.
So, if the Electoral College is what, the electoral votes are what decides the presidency,
Yeah, that's besides the presidency.
why do we have a popular vote at all?
It's come across because basically it's the people in each state deciding how their state's going to vote. It's an election by states, not a nationwide election. Initially, the Electoral College is put in place because the men designing the Constitution didn't have a lot of faith in the average American. Thought that most Americans weren't educated enough to make a proper decision about the president, so they'd have an election to decide who would decide the election, the Electoral College. This would either be decided by state legislatures or by vote of the people to get these electors together. And more just came over time a matter of just whichever party won the most popular votes in a state, that slate of electors would go and cast ballots for the electoral college. But let's finish up the totals here. Clinton v. Fisk, the Prohibition Party ticket. 2.2%. Union Labor ticket, Anson J. Streeter. It's 1.3%. And Republicans take control of both houses of Congress. Now, there are 4 times in American history in which the winner of the popular column, one of the most votes of the people, wins the they had the vote of most of the people 4 times, actually end up losing the election because they lost the Electoral College. So the first time that happens was 1824. Andrew Jackson won the popular vote but lost in the Electoral College, John Quincy Adams. 1876, in which Samuel Tilden won most votes in the country but lost to Rutherford B. Hayes in the Electoral College. This is the 3rd time. Harrison won most votes, but lost to Harrison in the Electoral College. 4th time, Al Gore losing to George W. Bush in 2000. Gore had won the election by 500,000 votes, but he lost in the Electoral College because of the disputed vote in Florida. So all 4 times that happened, the Democrat winning most of the votes, losing the Electoral College to the Republicans. So basically, that's one reason why it stays in place, because with one political party, it's always been an advantage for it. But now you got President Harrison. But what else is going on at this time period? You have the issue of women's suffrage. Now, the suffrage movement was increasing activity in the 1870s and 1880s. And interestingly enough, the New Jersey State Constitution of 1776 initially gave women who owned property the right to vote in that state. Because it was only an error. Basically said any resident of the state who owns a certain amount of property can vote. It didn't specify men only. So there were just enough women who inherited property here and there that they qualified to vote. So in the 1780s, on the early 1800s, that was not unusual, basically, to require that people own property to be able to vote. Basically, voting oriented towards the upper classes. So some New Jersey women held the right to vote briefly, but apparently the women's vote decided an election at one point, and the right to vote for women was stripped away by the early 1800s. Women in New Jersey would not regain the right to vote until 1920, over 100 years later. But before 1900, though, 4 states and territories gave women the right to vote only. Here on page 646, see where it comes. But it's all out west. The first territory to give women the equal right to vote as men was the Wyoming Territory in 1869. a couple of decades before they even become a state. Utah is next, the Utah Territory in 1870. Colorado was admitted as a state in 1876, gave women the right to vote in 1893. In Idaho, which was admitted in 1890, gave women the right to vote in 1896. My voice laughs hysterically whenever I mention the state Idaho. Never thought name. Native American name. But basically, it's all happening out west. See, what's happening is, as families are moving out to the west, settling this territory, it's women who are working with men side by side to build these farms, ranches, and communities. Essentially, they're proving their worth in a way that they would never have the opportunity to do so back east, back in more settled areas. Essentially, a lot of effort, a lot of hard work, women are slowly gaining the right to vote here and there. Well, you have several organizations back east working for this, particularly the National Women's Suffrage Association. Suffrage means gaining the right to vote. In 1875, they sued the federal government for the right to vote. The Supreme Court ruled the states had the right to deny women the right to vote. Congress, on several occasions, refused to pass the constitutional amendment that gave women the right to vote. And a dozen states defeated referendums on women's suffrage. But slowly, that progress is starting to come along. Like I say, a lot of effort by a lot of women, and even some men to try to push to give women the right to vote. But it's going to be a lot of very slow progress. They're fighting a lot of social convention. A lot of people thought that you have this Victorian era idea of the separate spheres. It is, there's men's work and there's women's work, and the two must not mix. Politics was men's work. It's dirty, it's corrupt, and they have to protect women from politics. So it took a lot of women basically pushing back social conventions to change those ideas. The idea that women could stand with men's equals, that women did have a voice and ideas to offer about how the community should be run. Particularly as women, most women basically were mothers and head of households. They had an important, adding their voice to the political process added an important dimension to American politics. Plus the very basic idea that women are people too. But the idea of women as equals, still a very radical idea in the 1880s. It's not we take for granted today, but it took a lot of women agitating for a long time, even being arrested and even killed, just to get that idea across. That people are different. That's the basic rule of life. You are who you are. You're a man, you're a woman, you're white, you're black, you're Hispanic, anything else. You are who you are. And there's nothing wrong with being who you are. But the question is, what do you do with it? Like I say, do you, if someone is holding you back because of who you are, you either accept it or you try to do something about it. And we live in a day and age, though, where there are no legal barriers left. Basically, it's what are you willing to do with your life? There's still a lot of attitudes lingering, but what are you going to do to change those attitudes? Well, we talked about politics of the 1880s. We talked about civil rights. Let's talk about economics. A lot of people vote. It's on economic issues. It's, I can keep my farm, I can keep my house, I can be able to feed my kids. And for farmers, by the 1870s, that's a big question. So we start with the origins of the Grange movement. Well, in 1867, an agricultural official named Oliver H. Kelly was touring the rural South and saw just how drab the life in the rural South was. So they formed a rural fraternal organization called the National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry. Basically, it's a club for farmers. Basically, a place where farmers would gather and they do all sorts of things. Just talk shop, talk farming. Grange organizations formed in communities throughout the South and Midwest. At first, the Grange tried to teach new scientific methods of farming, provide a social outlet for farmers. You'd have Grange dances and so forth. But the Depression of 1873 caused a sharp decline in farm prices. Membership surged. These people were really concerned about their standing. They got together, talked about economic issues, and steadily this became an advocacy group for farmers. Granges in the Midwest began forming marketing cooperatives, allowing them to circumvent the wholesalers and retailers to come to despise. You have to understand something about farmers. The only time they have money on hand is when the crop comes in. The rest of the time they have to live on credit. And of course you have these retailers willing to give them credit that takes 30-40% interest rates. So they're getting gouged, so they try to form these cooperatives, basically the farmers owning their own shops. And they moved in the railroad monopolies, warehouse monopolies, which are also gouging them. Well, the Granges succeeded in forming a network of farming cooperatives, put pressure on legislators to reform the railroad industry. And Grange supporters ended up winning control of most of the state legislatures in the Midwest, leading to the creation of what came to be called Granger laws in the 1870s. These are a series of laws regulating railroad rates and practices, basically trying to end discrimination on the hauling rates. Basically, railroads give special discounts to their favorite customers, usually the upper class, the rich farmers, while the working man basically gets the shaft. But what ends up happening is the Supreme Court ended up throwing out most of these Granger laws because these trains are crossing state lines, saying that only the Congress could do that, and Congress was not going to pass any kind of law regarding railroad rates at this point, until many years later. So these defeats ended up tearing apart the Granger movement by the end of the 1870s. Nevertheless, though, those still interested in the movement persisted and ended up passing the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887, pushing Congress to pass this. This basically federal law banning rates and banning discrimination in railroad hauling. And also created the first Federal Regulatory Commission. First Federal Regulatory Commission. Basically, the Interstate Commerce Commission, which survived for over a century till it was basically torn down and absorbed. Which helped a little bit, but here's the problem farmers are facing. It's deflation. 1866, wheat is selling for $2 a bushel. In 1870, though, prices are down to $1.30 a bushel. Basically down 35% in 4 years. By 1880, you're down to $1, down 50%. DBL stands for bushel. 1882. 1883, price is down to 65 cents a bushel. Essentially down it's down 78% in it's 75% in about a year, over this time period. So basically, if you're a farmer, a wheat farmer, you have to work almost 3 times as hard as your father did just to make the same amount of money. There's 3 times as much crop just to break even. And this is what's killing the farmers. Massive drop in commodities prices. You've got to remember what the difference between deflation and inflation. Quick definition. Deflation, prices are falling, value of money is increasing. It benefits creditors. Inflation, prices are increasing, value of money is falling, and it benefits debtors. To give you an example of this, suppose I borrow $100 from you. Yeah, from you.
I don't have $100.
Well, you're going to have it. You're going to have my money. Okay. I borrow it. Massive inflation sets in. Basically, prices double in space, let's say 6 months. Means the value of that $100 is decreased by half. So basically, when I pay back that $100, because of inflation, the value of it is actually closer to $50. So that benefits me a lot, because I borrowed that money, but I'm paying back what it's worth as much. Deflation sets in. Prices are dropping. I borrow that same $100 from me, massive deflation sets in. Prices cut in half, values doubled. So my paying you back that $100 in 6 months is like paying you back $200. Yeah. Like I said, it grows the value of the money, which means someone owed you money, you want deflation. Like I say, deflation might value the consumer, but if you're a producer like a farmer, it's killing you. But suppose you're a banker. People owing you a bunch of money, yeah, you want deflation to set in. That means that money you're paying back is worth more than what they paid you out. In the 1870s and 1880s, the bankers back east pushing for deflation, pushing for a strict gold standard to basically increase the value of money. So the federal government paying back all that money from the Civil War is paying them back basically as worth more than what they borrowed it for. And that's just going to be driving the politics on the plains in the 1880s and 1890s. That's why you have the Greenback Party saying push inflation, to push prices back up. Because they want these prices to go back up to where they were here. But the bankers are wanting this. Take as much money out of circulation, value of money rises.
So why do they loan? Why do they charge interest?
XA is the charge of borrowing money, basically. But they want extra deflation, which is, instead of raising interest rates, it increases the value of that money that is coming in. They can't change the interest rates if it happens, but those bankers are saying, we can change the value of that money coming in. Basically, they figured out another trick to make a little more cash on the side.
Okay, I thought that's what it was.
Because really so much of it does come down to money. And remember the basic rule on Wall Street? 3 basic emotions are greed, fear, and greed. Think about that.